Excuse me, did you see who passed by?
There are roles within society that create particular relationship to resources and power, where the uniform and the badge confer authority that most people assume includes capacity to solve problems through direct intervention, where the public expects that someone occupying position of official responsibility will have access to institutional resources sufficient to address the difficulties they encounter during their duties. Officer Daniel Hayes had occupied such a role for 11 years as patrol officer with the Greater Manchester Police Department, working primarily in the city centre district that included the busy commercial areas and residential neighbourhoods where the majority of public interactions with police occurred, where his presence in uniform created expectations about his capacity to help that he didn't always have the resources to fulfill but that he'd learned to navigate through combination of institutional knowledge and personal resourcefulness. Daniel was 37 years old, had joined the police force at 26 after working several years in various service jobs that had left him feeling unmoored and searching for work that felt more meaningful than just generating income, had been drawn to policing by combination of idealism about public service and pragmatic recognition that the position offered stable employment with benefits and pension that his previous work hadn't provided. The idealism had been partially eroded over 11 years of encountering the gap between what police work was supposed to accomplish and what it actually accomplished in practice, but he'd maintained commitment to doing the job as ethically and effectively as possible within the constraints that limited what any individual officer could achieve. His typical evening patrol, which he'd been assigned to for the past 6 years, working 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. shift 4 days weekly, covered approximately 2 square miles of Manchester city centre, an area that included the market district where vendors sold produce and prepared foods and various goods to residents and tourists, several major shopping streets with retail stores and restaurants, residential neighbourhoods with mixture of apartments and converted townhouses, public spaces, including small parks and transit stations where people gathered and where various forms of disorder and crime occasionally occurred requiring police response. The patrol was conducted primarily on foot with occasional use of police vehicle when situations required rapid response or when transporting people or equipment. Daniel preferred the foot patrol, allowed him to maintain more direct contact with the area's residents and business owners, created familiarity that made his presence less threatening and more integrated into the neighborhood's daily life, provided better awareness of the small signs that indicated emerging problems before they escalated into situations requiring more intensive intervention. The evening of November 18th had been typical until approximately 7:30 p.m., routine patrol, brief interactions with shopkeepers and residents, 2 minor interventions involving teenager skateboarding in prohibited area and homeless person whose presence in doorway was creating complaint from business owner. The kind of ordinary police work that constitutes the vast majority of patrol activity but that rarely appears in public discussions about policing that tend to focus on dramatic incidents rather than on the accumulated small interactions that actually characterize the job. The city centre at this hour on a Tuesday evening was busy without being overwhelming, hundreds of people moving through the streets conducting various activities, the market district beginning to close down as vendors packed up their stalls for the evening, restaurants and pubs beginning to fill with people having dinner or drinks, the transit stations handling steady flow of commuters heading home from work and evening activities. The atmosphere was typical urban energy, purposeful movement, ambient noise of conversations and traffic, the particular quality of November evening in England where darkness arrived early and the air carried damp coldness that made people move quickly between indoor spaces. The street lighting in the commercial areas was adequate, combination of municipal street lights and illumination from storefronts creating environment where visibility was good enough for public safety even after dark. The market district had additional temporary lighting that vendors used during operating hours, most of which was being dismantled as the evening market closed down. The residential areas had more limited lighting, relied primarily on streetlights that created pools of illumination separated by darker stretches where visibility was reduced. Daniel had been walking his standard route through the market district, exchanging brief greetings with vendors he recognized from months of regular patrol, when he'd been approached by a young woman who was clearly distressed, rapid breathing, anxious expression, body language communicating urgency and fear. His immediate assessment based on years of experience was that she was experiencing genuine crisis rather than attempting scam or manipulation, that whatever had occurred warranted serious attention rather than dismissal. The woman was in her mid-20s, dressed in casual clothing that suggested she was local resident rather than tourist, carrying large purse and several shopping bags indicating she'd been conducting errands in the market district. Her distress was visible, her hands were shaking slightly as she gestured, her voice when she spoke was higher pitched than probably normal for her, her eyes were moving rapidly as if she was still processing whatever had just occurred. "Officer, please, I need help," she said as she approached Daniel, her words coming quickly, almost stumbling over each other. "I just lost my wallet. I had withdrawn money, cash, £300, to pay for my mother's medical treatment. She needs it for a specialist appointment tomorrow morning and I don't have any other way to pay for it. I had the wallet in my hand and then I set it down for just a second while I was organizing my shopping bags, and when I turned back it was gone. Someone must have taken it while I wasn't looking." Daniel's training took over. He began asking standard questions designed to gather information while also calming the person experiencing crisis. "I'm Officer Daniel Hayes. What's your name?" The personal introduction was deliberate, created human connection rather than just official interaction, helped establish relationship that would make subsequent questioning more effective. Maya Thompson." Her voice was still trembling, but the direct question about her identity seemed to provide slight grounding, gave her something concrete to focus on rather than just the overwhelming panic about the lost wallet. "Okay, Maya, I'm going to help you. Can you show me exactly where this happened? Where were you when you last had the wallet?" Daniel kept his voice calm and professional, projecting competence and control that was meant to reassure Maya that the situation was manageable, that there was process for addressing this kind of crisis, even though Daniel knew from experience that recovering lost or stolen wallets was rarely successful. Maya led him approximately 40 feet to corner where several market stalls were in process of being dismantled for the evening, pointed to specific spot on vendor's table where she said she'd set down her wallet while reorganizing her shopping bags. "It was right here. I only looked away for maybe 10 seconds while I was putting the bags into my larger bag, and when I looked back the wallet was gone. I immediately looked around and asked the vendor if he'd seen anyone take it, but he said he hadn't noticed anything." Daniel spoke briefly with the vendor, a middle-aged man who operated fruit and vegetable stall, who confirmed that he hadn't seen anyone take Maya's wallet but who also acknowledged that he'd been focused on packing up his remaining produce and hadn't been paying close attention to the table where Maya said she'd placed the wallet. The vendor was sympathetic but not particularly helpful, hadn't witnessed the theft, couldn't identify potential suspect, couldn't offer information that would assist in recovering the wallet. Daniel scanned the area, looking for the wallet itself in case it had been dropped rather than stolen, looking for any witnesses who might have observed what happened, looking for surveillance cameras that might have captured the incident. The area had moderate foot traffic, perhaps 20 people visible within immediate vicinity, most focused on their own activities rather than on what had happened at Maya's location. No obvious witnesses, no security cameras visible from this position, though some of the nearby shops might have cameras whose footage could potentially be reviewed. "Do you have any backup plan for paying for your mother's treatment?" Daniel asked, shifting from investigation to practical problem solving, recognizing that recovering the wallet was unlikely and that Maya's immediate need was finding an alternative way to obtain the funds her mother required. Maya shook her head, tears beginning to form. "No, I don't. I spent the last 2 weeks saving that money from my wages. I work part-time at a café and my income is barely enough to cover my own rent and expenses. The £300 was everything I could scrape together for Mum's appointment. The specialist won't see her without payment up front because she's not covered under NHS for this particular treatment. It's a private consultation that her GP recommended because the NHS waiting list for this specialty is over a year and her condition needs attention sooner than that." The explanation revealed the particular cruelty of the situation. Maya wasn't losing luxury purchase or discretionary spending, was losing money that had taken significant time to accumulate and that was needed for her mother's medical care, was facing choice between finding the money somehow within the next 12 hours or having her mother miss the appointment that had taken months to schedule. The stakes made the loss feel more devastating than just the monetary amount, created urgency that simple theft report and insurance claim couldn't address. Daniel felt the familiar frustration that came from encountering human need that exceeded his official capacity to help. His role as police officer gave him authority to investigate crimes, to arrest suspects, to enforce laws, but didn't give him direct access to resources that could solve the practical problems that crimes created. He could file a report about the stolen wallet, could potentially review security footage if any existed, could enter the theft into police records that might eventually contribute to identifying patterns or suspects. But none of that would help Maya obtain the £300 she needed by tomorrow morning, wouldn't address the immediate crisis that required resources rather than investigation. "Let me see what I can do," Daniel said, his mind already moving through possibilities. "I'm going to call this in, get the theft on record, and then we'll figure out how to help with the immediate situation." He stepped slightly away to radio the incident to dispatch, provided basic details about the theft for official record, requested that nearby units be alert for anyone attempting to use cards from Maya's wallet or discarding the wallet itself after removing cash. The radio call took perhaps 90 seconds, fulfilled his obligation to document the incident while also buying time to think about how to actually help beyond just official procedures. When he returned to Maya, he was beginning to formulate plan. "Okay, the theft is on record. Now let me see if I can." He reached for his own wallet, intending to offer to lend Maya some money to at least partially cover her mother's treatment costs, recognizing this wasn't official protocol but feeling that the situation warranted personal intervention beyond his official duties. His hand found his pocket. Empty. He checked his other pockets. Also empty. The wallet that should have been in his uniform pocket wasn't there, and with sudden clarity he remembered that he'd left it in his locker at the precinct when he changed into his uniform at the beginning of his shift. Remembered that he'd deliberately left it there because carrying personal wallet while on duty created slight bulge that made his uniform fit awkwardly and that sometimes got in the way when he needed to access his police radio or other equipment. Daniel stood there with his hand in his empty pocket, experiencing a moment of profound irony. He was police officer, representative of institutional authority and resources, being approached by citizen experiencing crisis who reasonably expected he'd have capacity to help, and he literally had no money, no credit cards, no personal resources immediately accessible because he'd left his wallet at the precinct. The situation was almost absurd in its reversal of expected power dynamics. The person with authority and uniform had nothing tangible to offer, while the person experiencing crisis at least knew what resources she needed even if she didn't have access to them. Maya saw his expression, saw his empty hands, understood immediately what had happened. Her face showed confusion mixed with despair. If the police officer couldn't help, who could? Her eyes widened slightly, not with anger at Daniel but with the recognition that the one source of potential help she'd identified had just revealed itself to be unavailable, that she was back to having no solution to her immediate crisis. "I've left my wallet at the station," Daniel said, his voice showing embarrassment despite the fact that leaving personal belongings in lockers while on duty was completely normal procedure. "But that doesn't mean I can't help. Give me a moment to think." His mind was working rapidly through options. He couldn't access his own money immediately, couldn't leave his patrol to return to the precinct, couldn't break protocol by abandoning his assigned area for personal errand. He couldn't use police resources to give Maya money. The department's emergency assistance programs were minimal and involved bureaucratic procedures that took days to process, wouldn't help someone who needed funds by tomorrow morning. He couldn't arrest anyone for the theft because there was no identified suspect, and even if there had been, arrest wouldn't recover the stolen cash. But he could use his knowledge of the area and his relationships with local business owners to find solution that didn't depend on institutional resources or personal funds. There was café approximately 2 blocks from their current location, place called the Copper Kettle, family-owned operation run by a couple named Sarah and Tom Chen who'd been operating the café for perhaps 15 years, who Daniel knew from regular patrol interactions, who'd previously shown themselves to be generous and community-minded in ways that suggested they might be willing to help in this situation. "Come with me," Daniel said to Maya, his tone shifting from uncertain to decisive as he formulated his plan. "There's a cafe nearby where I think we can get help." They walked quickly through the evening streets, Daniel maintaining pace that communicated urgency while also projecting calm confidence that was meant to keep Maya from descending into complete panic. The walk took approximately 4 minutes, brought them to the copper kettle, which was still open, would remain open until 9 p.m., serving dinner and drinks to neighborhood residents and late workers. Daniel entered the café with Maya following, approached the counter where Sarah Chen was managing the register during the evening service period. Sarah recognized Daniel immediately. He stopped by the café several times weekly during his patrol, had developed friendly relationship with Sarah and Tom over years of regular interactions, had established himself as officer who was genuinely invested in the neighborhood rather than just enforcing regulations. "Sarah, I need to ask a favor," Daniel said without preamble, recognizing that extended explanation would waste time that Maya didn't have. "This is Maya Thompson. Someone stole her wallet while she was at the market, took £300 in cash that she needs to pay for her mother's medical treatment tomorrow morning. I want to help her, but I've left my own wallet at the station. Is there any way you could lend me, or lend her directly, enough to cover at least part of the cost? I'll come back tomorrow and reimburse you from my own funds." Sarah's expression showed immediate concern and sympathy as Daniel explained the situation. She looked at Maya, assessed the genuine distress visible in her expression and body language, looked back at Daniel, whose request was clearly serious despite being highly unusual. There was brief pause, perhaps 3 seconds, while Sarah processed what was being asked and made decision about whether to provide money to stranger based on police officer's request and promise of reimbursement. "Of course," Sarah said simply. "How much do you need?" The question was directed at Maya, who seemed almost unable to process that someone was actually offering to help. The specialist charges £300 for the initial consultation. I don't expect you to cover all of it, anything would help, I can try to find the rest somehow." Sarah opened the register, removed 6 £50 notes, handed them directly to Maya. £300. For your mother's treatment. Don't worry about paying it back right now, you can settle up with Daniel when you're able to, or you can just pay it forward by helping someone else when you have the opportunity. Maya stared at the money in disbelief, tears streaming down her face now. "I don't know what to say. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'll pay you back, I promise, as soon as I can save the money again. Just help your mother get better," Sarah said gently. "That's payment enough." After ensuring Maya had the money and had safe way to get home, after walking her to nearby bus stop and waiting with her until the bus arrived, Daniel returned to his patrol feeling the strange combination of satisfaction and discomfort that came from having solved problem through unconventional means that existed outside official procedures and institutional resources. The satisfaction was straightforward. He'd helped someone experiencing genuine crisis, had used his knowledge of community and his established relationships to find solution when official channels wouldn't have been effective, had demonstrated that being good police officer sometimes meant being resourceful in ways that training manuals and department policies didn't cover. Maya would be able to get her mother to the specialist appointment, would have this immediate crisis resolved even if she'd still need to deal with the longer-term problems of rebuilding her savings and managing her precarious financial situation. The discomfort was more complex. He'd operated outside normal procedures, had made personal commitment to reimburse Sarah without following any official process for approving such arrangements, had involved civilian business owner in addressing situation that arguably should have been handled through institutional mechanisms or through official victim assistance programs. He'd created obligation for himself, would need to return to the copper kettle the next day with £300 from his personal funds, which represented more than he typically spent on discretionary expenses but which was amount he could afford given his stable salary and modest lifestyle. But the discomfort also came from recognition of how much the situation had depended on factors beyond his control, his existing relationship with Sarah and Tom, their generosity and willingness to trust his promise of reimbursement, the fact that they had £300 available in the register that they could lend without creating problems for their own business operations. If any of those factors had been different, the solution wouldn't have worked, and Maya would have left the interaction with sympathy but no practical help. That recognition highlighted something Daniel had been increasingly aware of over his years in policing. that his effectiveness depended less on the authority and resources his position theoretically provided and more on the relationships and knowledge he'd developed through years of being present in the community. That being good police officer in ways that actually helped people often meant operating at the margins of official procedures rather than through them, that the uniform and badge were sometimes less useful than the personal trust he'd built with people like Sarah and Tom. The irony of the evening, that he'd been unable to help directly because he lacked his wallet while on duty, that he'd been forced to rely on civilian generosity rather than on institutional resources, that his empty pockets had required him to be creative rather than just pulling out his own money, had revealed something about the nature of his role that he'd understood implicitly but that tonight had become explicit. Police authority was often less powerful than people assumed. Institutional resources were often inadequate for addressing the immediate human needs that police encountered. Effective policing sometimes required acknowledging limitations and finding solutions through unconventional means. The rest of his patrol passed uneventfully. Daniel continued his rounds, completed his shift at 11 p.m., returned to the precinct and retrieved his wallet from his locker, verified that it contained the money he'd need to reimburse Sarah the next day. He filed brief incident report about Maya's stolen wallet, knowing the report would probably generate no results but fulfilling his obligation to document the crime for official records. Before leaving the precinct for the evening, he made note to himself to stop by the Copper Kettle early in his next shift to reimburse Sarah, to thank her properly for her willingness to help, to reinforce the relationship that had made tonight's solution possible. The note was practical reminder but also acknowledgement that his effectiveness as police officer depended on maintaining these kinds of community relationships, that being known and trusted by local business owners was asset that couldn't be replaced by official authority or institutional resources. Daniel returned to the Copper Kettle the following afternoon before beginning his patrol shift, arrived around 2:30 p.m. when the café was relatively quiet between lunch and evening service. Tom Chen was behind the counter this time, greeted Daniel warmly as he entered, clearly already aware of the previous evening's events from Sarah's account. "I'm here to reimburse you for the money Sarah lent to Maya last night," Daniel said, pulling out his wallet and counting out 6 50-pound notes. "I really appreciate what you did." That generosity made a real difference for someone who was in genuine crisis. Tom accepted the money, returned it to the register, then looked at Daniel with expression that communicated something more than just acknowledgement of repayment. "Sarah told me about what happened. What you did, using your relationship with us to help someone when you didn't have resources yourself, that's what community policing is supposed to be, right? Not just enforcing laws but actually helping people solve problems." The observation touched on something Daniel had been thinking about since the previous evening, about the gap between how policing was often discussed in public discourse and how it actually operated in practice when done well, about the difference between authority-based policing that relied primarily on enforcement and punishment and relationship-based policing that relied on trust and creative problem-solving. "I think so," Daniel replied. "Though I'm not always sure department leadership would agree with using civilian business owners as emergency lending services. What you did was generous, but it's not supposed to be your responsibility to solve problems that police encounter during their work." "Maybe not officially," Tom said. "But communities solve problems together. That's how it works when it works well. You've been part of this neighborhood for years, you know the people here, we trust you because you've shown yourself to be trustworthy. So when you asked for help with someone in crisis, of course we were going to help. That's not burden, that's just how neighbors support each other." The conversation continued for several more minutes, touching on various aspects of community relationships and policing and the ways informal networks of mutual support operated alongside formal institutional structures. Daniel left the café feeling validated in his approach to police work but also aware that the approach was fragile, depended on factors that could easily change, if he were transferred to different patrol area, if his relationship with community members deteriorated for any reason, if the community itself changed in ways that made these kinds of informal arrangements less feasible. He never learned the full outcome of Maya's situation, never knew whether her mother's specialist appointment had been successful, whether her mother's medical condition had improved, whether Maya had managed to rebuild her savings or continued struggling financially. He saw Maya once several months later, recognized her walking through the market district, received brief wave of recognition and gratitude that suggested she remembered their interaction, but that didn't involve stopping to provide detailed update. The lack of closure was typical of police work. You encountered people during crisis moments, provided whatever help was possible, then usually never learned how their stories resolved. Sometimes that was frustrating, left you wondering whether your intervention had made lasting difference or had just been temporary relief that hadn't addressed underlying problems. But sometimes the lack of closure was appropriate, was recognition that people's lives were their own to navigate and that police involvement was meant to be temporary intervention rather than ongoing relationship. What stayed with Daniel from that evening wasn't primarily the satisfaction of having helped Maya, though that was certainly present, but rather the recognition of the irony that had made the help possible, that his empty pockets had forced him to be more creative and relationship dependent than if he'd had his wallet available, that his lack of immediate resources had actually enabled better solution than simple personal loan would have provided, that the apparent weakness of having nothing to give had required him to draw on community relationships and trust that were more valuable than money. The lesson was subtle but significant, that effective public service sometimes meant acknowledging your own limitations and finding ways to mobilize community resources rather than relying solely on institutional authority or personal capacity. That being helpful wasn't primarily about what you had in your pockets or what authority your position granted, but about what relationships you'd built and what trust you'd earned through consistent presence and genuine care for the community you served. Integrity isn't about what you hold in your hands, it's about what you hold in your heart. The resources you possess, the authority your position grants, the money in your wallet, these are useful tools, but they're not the foundation of your capacity to help or to serve or to make meaningful difference in others' lives. The foundation is your commitment to acting ethically even when easier options are available, your willingness to invest in relationships that may never provide obvious return, your creativity in finding solutions when conventional approaches are inadequate. Daniel's story illustrates this principle through specific circumstances: police officer helping citizen experiencing crisis, but the principle extends beyond policing to any context where people are trying to help others or to serve their communities or to address problems that require more than just individual effort. Whether you're an official helping role like Daniel's police work, or an ordinary citizen role like Sarah's cafe ownership, or in any other position that creates opportunities to help, the effectiveness of your help depends less on the resources you control and more on the relationships you've built and the trust you've earned and the creativity you can bring to problem solving when straightforward solutions aren't available. So invest in relationships without knowing what return they'll provide. Be present in your community consistently enough that people know you and trust you. Develop reputation for acting with integrity and genuine care rather than for self-interest or bureaucratic compliance. Build the kind of social capital that allows you to mobilize resources when situations arise that require helping but that exceed your individual capacity to address alone. And when you encounter situations where you lack the immediate resources to help, when your pockets are empty, when institutional procedures are inadequate, when official channels won't address the problem quickly enough, don't assume that means you can't help. Think creatively about what relationships and community resources might be mobilized. Take personal responsibility for promises you make even when they're not officially required. Acknowledge your limitations while also recognizing that limitations sometimes force creative solutions that are actually more effective than resource-based responses would have been. The irony of Daniel's empty pockets forcing him to find better solution than simple personal loan would have provided isn't universal principle. Sometimes having resources immediately available is actually the best way to help, and sometimes creative relationship-based solutions aren't feasible or appropriate. But the irony does illustrate that lack of conventional resources doesn't necessarily mean inability to help, that apparent weakness sometimes requires strengths you didn't know you possessed, that being forced to rely on others can create better outcomes than individual self-sufficiency would create. Step up, think creatively, and act with honesty. Integrity isn't about what you hold in your hands, it's about what you hold in your heart. Be StoryWise.